Swifter, this is part 3 of our exercises where we're going full stack. We've already set up our Cloud Firestore database, we've set up Google Login, we've set up saving data. In this one, we're going to learn how to set up a real-time data listener that's going to push out any updates to all logged in users of our app. So we're going to be loading data from Google Cloud Firestore. And we'll also show some of the problems that can happen if you make changes to your data model in your app, but you have inconsistent data online, how to recognize that, and how to fix it. Let's code. All right, Swifters, in video number 3, we're going to do an exercise that solidifies your full stack journey. In the previous video, we've been saving records to Cloud Firestore. In this one, we're going to load records from Cloud Firestore. And now this is a review exercise for those that have been working through the Snacktacular app. We're going to rely on a lot of the code that we've already written, and we'll see that the code that we've written is very modular and only requires a little bit of a modification. Now, normally you just don't want to be copying and pasting code, but we've written code to be solid, to be reusable, and we want to be able to get through as many apps as possible in our course and prep you up for your final project. So let's get going. So in this project, we're going to create a teams class that has two properties, a team array that will hold an array of team object. And the reason that we do this in a separate teams class, a plural teams class, is we're going to add a load data method in here that loads and holds all of the team records. And we couldn't hold all of the records in the singular team. We need an array. So this team array inside of teams will be an array of team objects. We need to put the load data in something that has that plural array. Again, you can't do it in the singular class. So we'll do that. It's something very similar to what we did in Snacktacular. We also need to create an instance of the database object, and this time we need to do it in the initializer in our teams class. And that's because when we create the teams object, we want it to linger around. We're going to create something called a listener that will update our table view anytime we get a change in the database behind the scenes. So if somebody else is using the app and they add a record, delete a record, or modify a record, Cloud Firestore will immediately push those changes out to our app, and we'll see them in the app without having to do a pull to refresh or anything like that. Now we're going to declare that instance of the database up front, and we're going to do it in the initializer because we need the database to linger around as part of the initializer. That's as compared to the save data that we did, where we were able to dispose the database object as soon as we saved out our data. Now data in Cloud Firestore is read back in via a dictionary, so we also need to write another initializer, and this initializer will take any dictionary that we get back from Cloud Firestore, and it will give us back an individual team object. Then we'll reuse the load data function that we wrote earlier. It's very modular. It requires just some small modifications to change the data model from spot and spots to team and teams. Then we'll update our team list view controller. We'll change the teams object to the new teams type. We'll call the load data method of teams in view will appear. We'll update the table view extension for the new teams object with this new team array. And we'll be sure to add a prepare for segue so that any cell clicked will pass the team selected over to the team view controller. Let's code. For this model where you have an array of objects that you're sharing socially and you want to load multiple records at once, this is a pretty common one. So we've used this in Snacktacular to store spots or restaurants. We're going to use this in Hackathon to store Hackathon teams. This could be messages in an online forum that you're creating. It could be exercises that you're saving in a fitness app, really just about anything. So over here in our Snacktacular chapter in our textbook, I'm going to leverage the gists that we have to quickly set up the data model to hold multiple objects of the singular class we created. That was spot and spots in Snacktacular. We're going to change it to team and teams here in Hackathon. So I'll click on this gist. I'll copy the class code. I'll return to Xcode. Right-click on team so that I create a file just below it. New file. Swift file. Next. Call it teams, that's capital T and an S on the end. This is plural. It's going to hold multiple team objects. Click create. Paste this in. Notice that we have a statement import Firebase up top. And obviously this is a different class than spots, so we'll change the name to teams. And our array will be called team array. And this is an array of team objects. So now let's head over to our textbook to get more gists. And we need to create a load data method for teams. And our data is stored in Firebase in what Firebase calls documents, but they're read back into our app as dictionaries. These are key value pairs, sort of like JSON. Now, once we get the document turned into a dictionary by our app, we need to then take this dictionary and use the data inside to create individual team objects. So to do that, we're going to create a convenience initializer that, instead of taking individual properties to initialize an object, takes just one input, which is a dictionary. It strips out the individual key value value pairs and uses the values to initialize the new team object. And once we've created this, we can reuse the load data function that we've already written with just a small amount of modifications. So let's head over to this gist here, and this shows how to set up a convenience initializer that accepts a dictionary. And we have to modify most of the code, but it's good to have a model for how to format and set things up. So I'll highlight this, copy it. Remember, this goes into team singular.swift, not teams plural. So even though we'll eventually call it from teams plural inside of load data, we create one team at a time. So that's why this initializer that initializes a team goes into team.swift. I'll paste that in right here after the default initializer. And so here in this convenience initializer, we accept a dictionary as our parameter. String colon any between square brackets means all of the keys are strings, but the values can be anything. Remember, this is a format for a dictionary, so even though you see brackets, it's not an array, it's a dictionary. And the way that we get the values from a dictionary's key value pairs is you use the dictionary name, and in our code, our dictionary is called simply dictionary, and then in the brackets, while you would use brackets with a number in them in an array, in a dictionary, inside of the brackets, you put in the key name. Now our keys are all strings, and we named our keys when we saved our data. We used the same names as the variables containing the data that we're saving. And when we load in, we're going to take the values and put them in a property with the same name. Now, since we say any up here, we need to specify the type of each value. So that's why we downcast as. We say, hey, this thing that we're getting from the key, this is its type. Now, we may or may not get a legitimate value. There's a chance we might get a nil. So we specify the type as optional with a question mark, but by using 2 question marks afterward, this is nil coalescing, which means, hey, if we get a nil over here, then use this instead of a nil so that we never pass a nil into our value. Now we use this value that we get to create a constant, and then after we have all of our constants, we call our default initializer. And we need to make 2 diversions here. One is to create an Apple CL location coordinate 2D from a latitude and longitude that we saved to Google, and the other is to create an Apple style date from a Unix time interval from 1970 format. So back in our code, I'm going to quickly code the solution just as I showed you in the previous video. I'll fast forward this since we've already discussed the code. Now just to point out, I copy the property names and I paste them in between the double quotes for my key values to make sure that I don't have any typos. Good practice. I can also copy and paste these 3 lines down here that take the latitude and longitude and create a CL location coordinate 2D. I did the exact same thing in Spot and used the same names. We also need to work with converting the industry standard time interval to Apple's non-standard but very powerful date format. So now we actually need to update our dictionary too to make sure that we're saving a time interval and not a date. If we keep this, it'll be a problem. And we'll also make sure that we call our date key created on. So we're just going to convert from an Apple date to a time interval and then back from a time interval to an Apple date. Now our Apple date is in our created on property, so we'll say let time interval date equals created on dot, and there's a method for any Apple date where we can say time interval since 1970. Now it's a time interval, and we'll make sure that we pass in this value we just created named time interval. That's what's going to be saved out to Cloud Firestore with this key created on. So created on is going to give us a time interval. Now, updating the dictionary corrected a problem so that we're now saving as a time interval, and it's saved using the key created on. So down here, when we initialize from a dictionary after we've read the dictionary in from Cloud Firestore, we say let time interval equals dictionary, and then our key string is created on, just as we used above, as exclamation point, and that's going to be time interval the Apple type, upper camel case, with a question mark because it's an optional, 2 question marks for nil coalescing, and then that time interval type with an open and close parenthesis. There's not a type for time interval since 1970. A time interval is just a double. This will work perfectly. And now that we've got this time interval, let's create a date and put it in created on. So we'll say let created on equals capital date, that's the type, open parentheses. We're going to initialize this new date with time interval since 1970, passing in our time interval date that we just grabbed above. Perfect. Now I can delete all the code that I copied in from the gist. I still need to call the default initializer though, but what I can do is I can grab my call for the default initializer from my other convenience initializer. It's just instead of passing in empty strings or default values, I'm going to pass in each of these individual constants that I created above. Team name, university, coordinate, project name, project description, created on, posting user ID, and for my document ID, I'm going to pass in the empty string. And that's because the document ID isn't part of this dictionary, it's actually the name of the document. We've just finished all of the work on our team class. Now we can head back to our teams class. So now we can take a look in our book and click on the link to the gist for the load data function, highlight and copy it with Command C, head back into our code just before the closing curly. I'm going to Command V, paste that in, and the modifications are really easy. Any place where we have spot, we change to team. Any place where we have spots, we change to teams. So the first statement inside of load data, we want to make sure that our collection is the teams collection, all lowercase letters, not spots. Then inside of this for loop, remember we're calling that dictionary initializer now in the team class, so we'll put in capital team. And this is a local constant here, so instead of saying let spot, why don't we call it let team? Below that we'll say team.documentID. Below that we'll say self team array append team. Then I'll press Command F to bring up the find up top, and I'll type in the word spot and search. I get a whole bunch of places where spot is mentioned in the comments. Just for consistency, I'll make those changes too. Oh, and there's one more change down here. We had previously cleared out the array with a self.spot array. Now this should be self.team array. Good. That's all we needed to do. We've now got a load data method that can get data from Cloud Firestore and put that in our app. By the way, I'd mentioned this previously, but just to remind you, this error that you're seeing up here where it says no such module Firebase, this is just a quirk in the way that Xcode and CocoaPods are interacting. If you build and run, as long as your installation works fine and there's no other errors in your code, that will go away. And we'll see that happen in just a bit. Now the rest of the code that we need to write is going to be in Spot List View Controller, and we need to call load data, and we're going to do that in our view will appear. Now once we call it, it's going to constantly stay up and listen as long as this view controller exists in the background. So let's head back. We've got some code for this. Just scroll down to this section that says calling load data to set up our collection listener. We can click on the gist. Here's a little view did appear. I'll highlight the code, copy it with a Command C. Go back, I'm going to paste view will appear just below view did load and change spots to teams. Now remember, I mentioned in the previous video that we're going to have to change teams up here, so it's no longer going to be an array of teams, it's going to be an instance of teams. So we'll just say var teams : and then uppercase teams, exclamation point to force unwrap it. Now we just declared teams, we can't initialize it when we declare it because of how we're using the Firebase listener. But we will initialize it in view did load. Just below where we set up our auth UI delegate, we'll say teams equals capital teams, open and close parens. Now since we changed the teams variable to type teams, we need to make changes in our table view extension. So in number of rows in section, this now returns teams.teamarray.count, and the self row@ sets the text labels text property to teams team array indexpath.row .team name. So we're looking good. Now all we have to do is pass the team that the user selects from the table view over to our team detail view controller. That means we need to prepare for segue. We'll put that in right after our view did appear. So we'll get our prepare for segue from code completion, and we'll say if segue.identifier equals, and I'll put in a set of double quotes and open and close curlies. And I forgot what this identifier is, so I'll head over to main storyboard, click on this segue, look in the attributes inspector, it's show team, so I'll just highlight that, copy it, return to my code, and paste it in between the double quotes. And then it's our standard prepare for segue code. So we'll say let destination equals segue.destination as exclamation point, team detail table view controller, then let selected index path equals table view.index path for selected row, force unwrap with an exclamation, and then destination.team equals teams.team array, bracket, selected index path dot row close bracket. So now let's build and run, and we're going to run into some crashes. We're actually going to crash twice. These are both related to the fact that we changed our data model in our code. Now remember, we switched the dictionary to convert created onto a time interval and then load that time interval from the cloud. Well, the data that we saved previously was an Apple date. I'm actually surprised that Cloud Firestore let us do that because Google's been warning developers for several months not to do that. But anyway, if what we'd previously saved was an Apple date, we try to cram that into a time interval, it's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. That's why our code crashed. This is an important lesson. If you ever change your data model in your code, the data that you stored might not fit the new changes in your code, and that'll result in a crash. You might have to recreate your data or write a little program to reformat your data to the new format. So if we take a look at the line that this crashed on, it's in team.swift, and sure enough, it's right in here where we try to take what's being read from Firestore, created on, used to be of type date, and now we're trying to pass that into a time interval. That's why our code crashed. So I'm going to head back into my project. I'd closed up my console in my browser, so I've got to get back in Hackathon and then click on database. But you see, I've got a couple of documents, so 2 teams are inside of my teams collection. And one thing I can do to delete all of my data is right in the column that says teams, if I click on the triple dots, I can select delete collection. Now what that will do is it will delete this teams collection and all of the documents that are inside of it. So it deletes all of the data that's inside of my app. That's okay, I'll go ahead and do this, but you'll see in just a second, this isn't enough. So first Google's making sure that I really want to delete this, so it's requiring me to type in the word teams. That's great, I wouldn't want to do this by accident. Click delete, that data's gone. I'm going to head back to my code, I'm going to build and run, and I'm still going to get an error. And I wanted to show you this because it can be really confusing as to why this is happening. The way that we've written our code is we load our data in view will appear, but we don't check our sign-in until view did appear. So by trying to load our data first, if we're already logged in, one of the things that Cloud Firestore will do is it will read data that's cached locally on your device. The fact that Firestore caches data locally is actually a really good thing. It lets you use Cloud Firestore even if you lose internet connection for a while. It will sync things back up with the cloud. It's awesome. But this is bad software engineering on my part for this example. It's always better to check the login before you go ahead and read data. And in this situation, even though we got rid of all the data in the cloud, there was still some data that was cached locally. We read it in, it was in the old format, that's why our app crashed. Now, probably the easiest way to fix this is to delete the app. That'll delete the local data, then we can go ahead and restart this, and not only are we going to be starting with new data in the cloud, we're also going to be starting with new data that's cached locally. There's essentially no data anywhere. So from within my app, I've clicked on the home icon in the simulator, then I'll long press on the Hackathon icon, select to delete, and now if I go and build and run, I've got no data cached locally and no data in the cloud. And now we'll see everything's going to work. Better practice might be not calling table view reload data unless you've verified that the person is logged in. You might want to save that as an exercise for you to try on your own, but everything's looking good. Finally, no crashes, but also no data, so let's click on plus to add a Hackathon team. I'll fast forward ahead. I'm just going to add my Hoders Coders team. Click save, and whoa, Hoders Coders appears. Now, you might notice we didn't do any unwind segue. We didn't pass any data back with a prepare for segue in our detail view controller. How did this show? That's what our snapshot listener does. Cloud Firestore hangs out. It will report back to our app if any records have been added, deleted, or modified, and that dramatically cuts down on the code that we've got to write when we pass data back and forth between view controllers. The only thing we did do was a prepare for segue in the team's list view controller with the table view, and that was only to pass over whichever cell was clicked on in the table view, and even that was less complete than the normal ones that we write because we didn't have to deal with the plus case where we added a record. We just added a record now, and it went ahead and updated things for us. We didn't even have to do that pull to refresh that you see in so many other apps. Nice! So just to demonstrate some more things, I'll fast forward adding a couple more teams. Let's see, we'll have the Swiftettes from Boston College, we'll have the Bug Crushes from Gonzaga. Each time we click on save and add a record, our table view is updated automatically. This is full stack splendidness, just what you want. But wait, there's more! Now I'm gonna sign out. I'm going to close our app. I'm going to build and run again. Let's take a look at what we've got inside of our Cloud Firestore database console. We've got the 3 records we added. Nice. Here's our app. We'll log in. No crashes. We see all 3 documents, all 3 teams load up from our collection name teams. Perfect. Just what we want. Now, Cloud Firestore is a real-time database, so I want to show you what happens when updates happen outside of the app itself. I'm going to position things really quickly. I'll move my database console over to the right so that you can still see my simulator executing. And so let's imagine that the Bug Crushes and Gonzaga want to change their name, so I'm going to click on the document in the console. I'm going to click on team name. Bug Crushes spelled like this is actually the Twitter handle for a well-known iOS developer named Jazzbo. He's now on the Apple TV team. Follow him online. We won't bogart his Twitter handle. We'll click on the pencil. That will allow us to edit the data in the cloud. It's not being edited in our app, but let's watch our app. We're going to change the name of the team to Zagtastic, and then click on Update, and whoa! That change happens automatically in our database. No need to pull the refresh. That's what a real-time database does. If we had other users that were logged in with their versions of the app and they made changes, those changes would immediately be pushed out to every user that's logged in. Nice! Now what happens if we go ahead and delete this document? I'm going to pull down on this triple dot, select delete document, say this is what I want to do, and ho! The Zagtastic team is now gone from the hackathon. This is splendid. You are full stack, baby. Hope you're feeling good about your Swift skills. Hopefully this is now solidifying concepts that you learned about in Snacktacular. Keep at it.